Hey everybody, Topic 2, Strategic Writing and Public Relations. Topic 1 in this class set you up in the frame of mind and with the concept skills that you need to begin working as a public relations writer. Now in Topic 2, we're going to begin practicing those skills in earnest. And I want this to be really serious, focused attention. And in the online format of this class, it's real easy not to do that. It's real easy to just slide by. I don't want you to do that because I want you to give lots of thought and attention to the items that you're creating here. You're going to need to rely on that step-by-step writing guide from Topic 1. Don't just let that go. I've taught this class many times to hundreds of people over the years, and it is not uncommon for students to just forget the step-by-step writing process and move on without it, and you can't do that because that's the backbone of what we're doing here. Okay, so the assignments in Topic 2 are the news release and the backgrounder. I use these two assignments because they are so essential to what public relations writers do. Back in the 80s and 90s when I was working in PR, the news release was much more important than it is today. It's not as important today as it used to be, but it's still there. It's still the backbone of what we do. And if you can write good copy for a news release, you can write good copy for anything because the news release is the backbone. I don't know how to express it any other way. The news release and the backgrounder are the core of what we do in this profession. Even if those actual tools aren't used as much, the skills, the concepts that we use are really essential. And you need to have those core skills to be a public relations writer. The news release, for example, requires you to tell a very persuasive and complete story in only about a page of copy. And so you've got to be creative and you've got to be complete because you don't have a lot of space to tell the story. And you're directing that story toward journalists or media gatekeepers who are busy people, often very cynical, not very easy to persuade. You have to structure the story in a way that will capture the attention of even the most cynical person, and this is not easy to do. And this is why I say if you have a chance to do any job shadowing, internship, employment observation, anything in a newsroom, you really ought to take that chance and do it because it's very difficult to be cognitively a complete public relations person if you have never experienced life in a working newsroom. And I'm very fortunate. I've experienced working newsrooms as an employee in television and radio and newspapers. I've spent a lot of time in a newsroom, and that understanding, that experience tempers everything I do as a PR people because I know how journalists think. I know how they tick, and knowing how they tick allows me to write effectively for that kind of person. Now, that doesn't mean that everything I write gets accepted. I had something rejected just recently. So, everything I write doesn't get embraced by journalists. But that's okay. That's part of the process. But I know how they work. I know how they think. I know how they tick. And so, as you move forward towards your career, any opportunity that you have to be part of a newsroom, you should grab it and do it. And even if you have a chance to be part of Daily Titan or Titan TV, you should be part of it because it will help you immensely. Okay, so the news release is the balance of art and craft, putting together a single-page, newsworthy item to catch journalistic attention. The backgrounder involves similar concepts, but you're telling a story with more detail, less persuasion, but more detail so that the news value of the story is really evident. The backgrounder gives background information that makes the organization appear newsworthy so that a news story can be generated. That's a very good thing. Through this kind of work, what you're doing is balancing art and craft. Again, as discussed in the previous topic area, The art of public relations is the storytelling. The art is choosing the right words and putting them in the right order to tell an informative and persuasive story to a very particular audience. And if you haven't thought of who's in the audience, you really need to do that. The craft part of public relations is structuring that story on the page or whatever format you've got in a way that the recipient will be most inclined to accept it. In a case of journalists and gatekeepers, they need to see the news release or the backgrounder structured in a very familiar way. You cannot send a news release that looks funky and weird because no matter what the content of that news release is, gatekeepers won't accept it. They won't even read it. They'll make a paper airplane and go to the trash can. They won't even read it. It doesn't matter what the content is. And likewise, on the other side, the flip side of that is you can draft a news release that structurally is just right. I mean, it looks really good, but if the copy has mistakes or if the copy is just not literate, again, they'll start reading, they'll get 3 sentences into it and go, and it's gone because they don't have time to waste. They don't have time to waste. Statistically speaking, about 80% of news releases sent to the media don't get used. Now, in some cases, they don't get used because a big news event comes along that pushes the news release off the radar screen. There's an earthquake or a fire or Donald Trump does something stupid. Well, that happens every day. That's not a good example. There's some major news, and it pushes your news release off the radar screen, and so it's not going to get used. That happens. But from my experience on a regular basis, most news releases don't get used because they simply don't tell a good story. They're not artistically appropriate. They're not appropriate from a craft or structural standard. They just look stupid. I've got a file full of news releases that are shocking how awful they look that I've collected over the years. Shocking! And so you've got to tell a good story from an artistic standpoint, and you've got to make it look good. And if you don't do that, the journalist is just not willing to invest the time and the effort in what you're presenting. Now, it's important that we understand the environment of the newsroom and the factors that work into all of this. The newsroom today is a far busier and a more frenetic place than it was when I was working in the business. Today's journalists work on as many stories in a day as I worked on in a week. I had lots of freedom. I covered trials. I wrote extended multi-part series on environment. I had lots of freedom. I always had lots of stories cooking at any one time, but if I needed a week to work on a story, I got it. That doesn't happen today. The pace of everything has ramped up dramatically, so journalists don't have time to mess around with news releases that aren't right. If you send them something that's lacking in artistry or in structure, they're just not going to be interested in it, and they're not going to invest time in your story because they got 10 other things that are going on today that have to get dealt with. So this is the part of the reason why the news release, we do it in 2 elements in this class. We do the draft, and then we do the final. So we're basically doing a draft exercise here. You're going to draft the first copy of the news release. I want you to have a discussion with members of your team about the copy, and I want you to get as many eyeballs as you can on that copy so that you get feedback from your peers before you turn in that draft. Then you're going to submit that first copy to me, and I'm going to review it and give it back to you with a score and comments. It's essential that you take my comments into consideration as you revise that draft into your final copy. It's also essential that you give that assignment some time so that you think about the changes that you need to make to turn that draft into the final copy of your news release. You want to make that final as good as you possibly can. In the past, I've actually had students get all the way to the end of this class and admit that they never went back and looked at any of my feedback or corrections. They only looked at the scores and didn't pay any attention to anything else. I had one student in the last week of the class, very apologetic. She didn't realize I had been sending feedback. Really? You didn't realize? So, I don't want you to be there. I spend a lot of time with these draft news releases. I look at them very carefully. I give lots of feedback. I make corrections and improvements. I make suggestions for how you can make this thing as powerful as possible. But you know, every now and then I get a final news release that looks exactly like the draft that came in. And so that means my comments and suggestions, the person wasn't interested. And so I score the final accordingly. So, you know, this is one of the few classes, and perhaps the only class, where the instructor is urging you to talk to your fellow students about the assignment. And, you know, there's a million different ways to write a news release from the fact set, so I'm not worried about plagiarism here. I want you to all share your ideas and look at each other's work, and then take that and filter it through your brain as you work on your news release. So take advantage of that opportunity to get input on what you've written, and look at other people's work and give them feedback on what they've written. You know, that's going to clarify where everybody wants to go with this assignment. And you know, the only time we're going to have a problem with plagiarism is if I see two news releases that are exactly identical. And if I see two news releases that are exactly identical, I know we had plagiarism. And there's no reason for that, because there's a million different ways to express these things. So anyway, you will notice in the titanium area for this subject, there's a lot of content that doesn't directly relate to the writing of a news release or backgrounder. But they're important items in there. A couple of them have to do with mindfulness. Mindfulness is one of my research interests. It's a personal interest. It's so important for us to be mindful of the work that we're doing so that we can slow down and we can focus and we can concentrate on the elements of the work that are most important. Simply put, when you write from a distracted standpoint, you're not doing your best work. You know, if you sit down to write at the computer and you're thinking about all the other classes and you're thinking about where you have to go tonight, and you know the car has a flat tire, and you know, this is going on and this is going on, and you're on your phone and you're texting and the phone is ringing, and you know, you are totally distracted, and you're not going to do your best work. So I recommend that regardless of, you know, how focused you are when you actually work on the news release and the backgrounder, after you write what you're going to write, set it aside. You know, maybe you've only got a few hours. Okay, if you only got set it aside, go do something else, then come back to it. Ideally, you have a couple of days maybe to write, set it aside, come back to it. You will see things you did not see the first time around, and you will be able to make corrections and changes that will make it so much better. I do that in all my own writing. I always set something aside for 3 or 4 days, unless I'm on a deadline and I can't. I set it aside for 3 or 4 days and come back and look at it, because it's so important to have that pause. It really helps you be a more mindful writer. Also in titanium, I have some information about photo manipulation. This is a topic that's very relevant today. We live in a world that is driven by visual images. As PR experts, we need to think about how the visual image complements the written word. There is a lot of ethical issues that we have to think about. When is it acceptable to manipulate a photograph? When and where is it acceptable to publish it? Do you need to tell people it's manipulated? You know, those are real significant ethical and professional concerns that relate to this topic area. And for that matter, social media itself is so dangerous. It presents so many opportunities for public relations crisis. I'm recording this video on January 22nd, on Tuesday. Over the weekend, this past weekend, a public relations crisis hit the national news media involving those young men from the Catholic high school in Kentucky who were in Washington, D.C., and allegedly harassed Native Americans at one of the national monuments. I wasn't there. I don't know what happened. But the social media portrayal is terrible. It is really offensively terrible. And the snarky, smiling, smirking face of the alleged leader of that student group has been on all the social media. And it's been on all television, social media, Facebook, Instagram, New York Times. It's been everywhere. And so it offers a very negative portrayal of what was happening there in Washington. And so it's another example of how dangerous social media is and how quickly still photographs and videos go viral. And we as PR people need to be very mindful about the work that we do, because it is so easy to get into a jam. And then when somebody comes to you to try to correct their image, Is it appropriate for you to do that, or do you just back away from this one? One of the other items in Titanium is the story about UC Davis and about how that university has worked so hard and spent so much money to scrub unpleasant photographs of an altercation between campus cops and students that happened years ago when campus cops pepper sprayed innocent students on campus, unarmed students. And UC Davis has been spending a lot of money to make those pictures go away. And you know what? They don't go away. Once you're on the internet, you live forever. Ask Monica Lewinsky all about that. So what we learn from this as PR people is that we have to be very, very careful about what we write and about the images that we associate with our writing, because what we create is going to last forever. And that requires a very thoughtful and mindful approach. And on that happy note, I'm going to leave you to do your work. Please let me know if you have any questions about topic 2. I want to have as much discussion as possible on these important assignments so that everybody has the best chance for success. And that's the story for today. Thanks.